What is your name?
My name is Brian Walker. In Houston, we have no problem.
Only one is the real Brian Walker and has sworn to tell the truth.
Here we are again in the beautiful Columbia River Gorge, and this is Horsetail Falls, one of my favorites. It's just, well, it looks like a horse's tail. I guess it's better than looking like a horse's ass. But then again, the tail is on the ass. So anyway, this is the Flaming Brain Podcast.
Hi, and welcome back to the Flaming Brain Abides. And I'm your host, Brian. And today is my first segment dealing with what I consider to be just about the worst condition any human can have, which is bipolar disorder. It's just beyond the pale of how horrible it is. So today I'm going to start out with just some basics about being bipolar. And I want to say that I'm not going to go into a whole lot of explanations on all the little idiosyncrasies and the behaviors and all that, because there's plenty of people that have YouTube videos and podcasts all about the mechanics of bipolar. Most notably, a guy named Robert Whitaker on Polar Warriors. Very good site. He has a lot of good information, but I'm going to be focusing more on what unknown, unchecked, and unbridled bipolar disorder has meant in my life, because I didn't find out I was bipolar until I was 53, which is like way too late to expect you're going to come up with some kind of magic pill that's going to make things better. I mean, a person with bipolar disorder needs to get on this as early and as soon as possible so they can begin to come up with ways to fight it and not let the mania or the depression take over. So that's the thrust here. Now, just to give an explanation here, bipolar is actually a very descriptive term in the sense that bi means two and poles means north, like North Pole, South Pole. Now, with bipolar disorder, the North Pole is the home of mania, and that's the thing most people don't understand, what mania is, what it can do to you. It's so powerful. I like to think of mania as a tsunami, a 30-foot wave racing towards shore, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. It is going to do what it's going to do. That's pretty much what it's like when mania takes over. And then, of course, the South Pole, down here, is where manic depression resides. And when I talk about bipolar manic depression, I'm not talking about, I like to call it depression light, which is the kind of depression, and actually it's more of a sadness that normal people may experience over the course of their lifetime, and it's almost always due to something that happens. You lose your job, you lose your family, your wife, your whatever, your savings, and this will bring on this high level of sadness. But most people will, they'll move past it. So consider bipolar light to be a cancer, but we're talking basal cell carcinoma. Now, manic depression, on the other hand, is a whole different beast. I mean, it doesn't necessarily come from a happening. With me, it can come out of a clear blue sky and hit me like a load of bricks in a half a heartbeat, and I can go from feeling relatively okay to literally being suicidally depressed. That's how different bipolar light is against manic. Depression light as opposed to manic depression. So if the depression light is basal cell carcinoma, consider manic depression as stage 4 pancreatic cancer. That's how much difference there is between the two. And I like coming up with metaphors for things, and one of the metaphors I came up with for being bipolar would be like living out your life on an underinflated air mattress that is floating around on a lake of raw sewage. And that's what you have to live with. That is kind of close to what it's like, because it is so terrible, it is so controlling. It's ugly, ugly, ugly. And what's sad is nobody who isn't bipolar can even begin to understand what this is like. This is my purpose for being here, is I'm trying my best to get people to see a couple things. First of all, to not be afraid of bipolar people, to not be afraid of mental illness in general, which people are. I have found that very few people want to acknowledge mental illness. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to know about it. They just rather la 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 and not even know it exists. And this is very disheartening when you're bipolar, is that feeling of being so totally isolated and alone, because no one knows the pain a bipolar person goes through. Most people have disabilities. They're quite obvious, whether it's physical or other issues. But when you're bipolar, you look and act, well, you look and appear to be totally normal. You don't act normal, but people don't recognize a bipolar person as having a disability. They just don't get it. So anyway, that's the whole point. Now, of course, between North Pole and South Pole, you got the equator. So this is where you're neutral. You're not manic. You're not depressed. You're just kind of going along in a neutral mode. Unfortunately for me, I have spent very little time on the equator. Maybe 10% of my life, I've actually been in a neutral zone. The rest of the time, I've either been manic or depressed. And that's just kind of like the way it is. And like, as you travel upwards, the closer you get to the actual pole, the more intense the mania can become. You get up here too far, and you can deal with delusions of grandeur, believing you're people you're not. Or if you get too close to the North Pole, you might end up with psychosis, where you're really having problems getting around and being able to survive. But for me, mania has always been like an alter ego, a second personality, this creature that lives in the back of my mind that is pretty much the opposite of me and will do everything the opposite of what I would do. And it's a terrible way to live, but it's just the way it is. You can't get away from it. And I actually, to me, mania is a whole different persona. And if you want to know what it's like, having that kind of mania driving you all the time, I got an image here, which I'll admit is disturbing, but I'll tell you, the image is not half as disturbing as having this condition. So on a semi-conscious level, when mania comes into my life, this is how it feels. Someone behind me with a gun, and if I don't do what he says and go where he says, I will simply die. So that's what it's like for me, because I can't speak for any other bipolar person. We're all, we all have certain traits and characteristics that are common to everyone who's bipolar. But when it comes down to the little tiny parts, like some people will get delusional when they're manic, and maybe they believe they're a cop or a doctor. I've met two guys that believed that. One believed he was a cop, one believed he was a doctor, and he used to go into hospitals and start walking around from room to room, talking to patients like he was a doctor until he'd be kicked out. So other people can have real psychosis and have serious issues to have to deal with. Me, on the other hand, fortunately, my mania was mostly restricted to flights of fancy, becoming hyper creative, because I've been an inventor all my life, and my creative mind has always been my trademark. But that's where my mania would take me to. So I fortunately didn't suffer the problems of thinking I was a cop or a doctor or a woman or something. I don't know. And also, the mania would just drive me to do things that were not reasonable. I mean, especially when it came to spending money. So, because up to the age of 38, I never had 2 pennies to rub together. I couldn't hold down a job to save my life. I never had a savings account. I was homeless 6 times. I even lived under an overpass in Simi Valley, California for a few months back in early 90s. But I would just do really different kind of things. So I'm going to go through some of these now to give you an idea of just how insane I could act. Because I'm not insane. I just act that way. One of my earliest, I won't want to call it a manic episode, but one of my earliest manically driven projects. In 1977, I had this idea to build portable litters for carrying injured soldiers. And the idea was that they should fold up into a very small size. So for 9 years, I just wouldn't give up on it, even though I had no indication I would ever get a military contract, that I would ever get investors. It just didn't matter. The mania drove me to make the best product I could. And I went through like 9 different iterations until I finally got it perfect. So here you can see the finished product. This is the 9th version, and it worked beautifully. It even had a tent. And even though I sold a couple hundred to a number of military bases around the country, and they liked it, the Army liked it, I could never attract any investors because no one wanted to invest money without seeing a military contract. But the fact is, the military isn't going to give a contract until they've had hundreds and hundreds of these that they could put through all sorts of every theater of war, Arctic, desert, jungle, urban. And until I had been able to produce enough to supply their needs for testing, there'd never be a military contract. And then even if they approved it and they wanted to buy it, they would have had to then put it out to competitive bid. And I could actually end up not being able to provide them if I couldn't give the lowest bids. I learned right then and there, don't even think about working on products for the military. My next manic episode has to do with this, let's see, right here, my hovercraft. You see, I think it was 1984, I saw an article in Popular Mechanics magazine, and they had the plans to build this thing called the Pegasus hovercraft. So here you can see the original Pegasus, and what I did was turn out something a whole lot nicer and a whole lot more powerful. So with my hovercraft, I had lasers on them and sensors, and I wanted to create a place called Hoverland, which would be like floating bumper cars meets video games meets laser tag. And did a whole lot of work, but never went anywhere. That's the problem with Mania. Now, I have always been intrigued by the undersea world. In 1964, there was a movie called World Without Sun. It was about Jacques Cousteau, and he was cruising around underwater in all these really cool-looking little submarines. They look like flying saucers, actually. And that got me really, really intrigued. So it wasn't until 1978, when I was, 22, I saw another article in Mechanics Illustrated magazine. And this was for a product called the Aqua Sub, and it was designed to take one person just below the surface, about 4 feet, because those wings would pivot when the center part went down, and then those floats stayed on the surface just like this. And the moment I saw that, I thought, wow, that's got to be made a two-man, and they got to be designed so that they can be put in tropical resort locations around the world. And I had this idea, but for that was in '78. It wasn't until 1986 that the opportunity came along for me to follow through with that. So this was my version, and it had one float up above, and of course the lower part is where you sat, and it would go underwater. Another big manic episode was when I decided to build a 1/2 scale model Luke Skywalker land speeder from Star Wars for the Bend Pet Parade. And my goodness, I was supposed to just work on this for a couple months, but I spent like 3 years and $4 or $5 grand to build this thing, and it was a hit of the parade. But that shows you just a mania. And I once put a little jet engine on my bicycle. I got it up to 58 miles an hour. Then I put 2 of them on my go-kart and got it up to 78 miles an hour. Then there was a slingshot zipper, a twin jet-powered catapult-launched guided missile that you basically aimed right to your destination, and there were no controls, and then it used a parafoil parachute for landing. I also built a number of additional aquatic products because I just had a love for that. And of course, my compressed air cannon that could launch an 8-pound bowling ball a half a mile. And after building my giant geodesic dome, I looked at the top one day and said, hey, that'd be a great place for my 12-inch telescope. So I proceeded to build this super heavy-duty staircase and a little club up top and my telescope, and it even had an elevator. And so on and so forth. I'd get an idea for something and I'd spend a fortune to make it. But then came my biggest, longest, most expensive manic episode of all time. It was when I started in 1994 the plans to build a rocket and launch myself 30 miles high to the edge of space and be the first private citizen to do so. And I started my project a good 7, 8, 9 years ahead of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson. And as you can see here, I built numerous models, different types, flying wing type, just a bunch of different ones. And this was going to be my test rocket. I was going to go up 18,000 feet from and skydive from it. And then this was the one I was going to go 30. I even built my own training equipment, the Mad Machine, and my own centrifuge. I could pull 10 Gs. And then, of course, there was like really ridiculous spending. I mean, dumb, stupid spending. In 2003, I had a GMC Sierra pickup truck, a BMW M Roadster, a BMW M5, and a Mercedes E320. So when it was time to go pick up some lambskin seat covers for my E320, I was on my way out of the dealership, on my way home, when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. And without even thinking twice, I simply whipped out my checkbook and wrote a check for $250,000 for 2 more cars. And in March or April of 2000, can't remember, I was watching a news story, and I was watching the news, and there was a story about a expedition adventure company in Seattle called Seagram Expeditions, and they were organizing their last astronaut or cosmonaut training vacation to where you could go to Russia and spend a whole week training right alongside Russian astronauts. And of course, with my rocket project coming up, it's like, well, I've obviously got to do this. So by the time that news story had finished, I was already on the phone with Seagram and had planned my trip for June, like within minutes. And everybody in our group of 7 thought that the best training part was the zero gravity flight. And yeah, it was pretty cool. And it was about 9 months later, after returning from my first trip to Russia, I once again turned on the TV, and there was a news story about a company that was offering the opportunity to go to Russia and fly in a MiG-25 to the edge of space, 85,000 feet high at 2.5 times the speed of sound. And once again, as soon as I heard it, I had to do it. And it was too late to call the company that evening. So the next morning, I was on the phone and I booked my trip for like 6 weeks ahead, like in 6 weeks. And the MiG-25 is the second highest and fastest flying aircraft ever built, next to the U.S. SR-71. And the Russians built 1,156 of these during the Cold War. And of course, they were built for a nuclear war against the U.S. So it was pretty cool all these years later now that I was able to fly in this jet. It was an awesome experience. But now I've got to report something that's probably going to have a lot of men out there really pissed off at me and angry and saying, why you, why not me? Well, I don't know. I can't answer these questions. It's just things happen to me. So the other day I was going through the Burger King to get a burger. And when I got to the window, they surprised the hell out of me when they crowned me a king. Can you believe that? Me, a king? Who would ever thought it? I would have been happy as a prince, maybe as a duke. But no, they made me a king. The only question is, what kingdom am I going to rule over? Well, there's only one kingdom I want to rule over. The kingdom of Hooters.